January 1945. A frozen warehouse on the outskirts of Berlin. Dr. Heinrich Becker, chief engineer at the Heeresversuchsanstalt Kummersdorf, Germany's primary weapons testing facility, stared at the objects laid out on the examination table before him. 3 American artillery shells, 105 millimeters, recovered from the Ardennes battlefield. They looked ordinary enough from the outside. Standard high-explosive rounds, the kind that had been raining down on German positions for months. But these shells were different. They had been found unexploded, buried in the snow near the town of Bastogne, and the reports accompanying them were disturbing. Frontline soldiers described a new American weapon, artillery shells that detonated in mid-air with perfect precision, raining shrapnel down from above. Shells that made foxholes and trenches useless. Shells that seemed to know exactly when to explode. The reports seemed impossible. Airburst artillery required precise timing fuses, calculated by experienced gun crews based on distance, altitude, weather conditions. Getting it right was difficult. Getting it right consistently was nearly impossible. And getting it right in the middle of a blizzard, with poor visibility and chaotic battlefield conditions, was beyond the capabilities of any army. Yet the Americans were apparently doing exactly that. Every single time. Becker had been summoned to find out how. As he carefully began to disassemble the first shell, removing the nose cone to expose the fuse mechanism, Becker had no idea that what he was about to discover would be more than just an explanation for a tactical problem. It would be a revelation about the true nature of the war Germany was losing. A war not of soldiers and tactics, but of scientific capability and industrial capacity on a scale that defied comprehension. Becker worked methodically, photographing each step of the disassembly. His hands were steady, despite the knowledge that even a dud artillery shell could be dangerous. One wrong move, one accidental trigger, and he'd be scattered across the warehouse. When he finally removed the outer casing of the fuse assembly, he stopped. For a long moment, he simply stared. Inside the nose of the shell was a device unlike anything he'd ever seen. A compact assembly of components, precisely machined and carefully arranged. At first glance, it looked like a miniature radio set, which was impossible. Radios were delicate instruments. They required careful handling. The idea of putting one inside an artillery shell that would experience forces of 20,000 times gravity when fired was absurd. Becker called over his assistant, Hauptmann Franz Weber, an electrical engineer who'd worked for Telefunken before the war. "Franz, come look at this. Tell me what you see." Weber leaned over the table, his eyes widening. That's a radio transmitter and a receiver, and what looks like an amplifier circuit." He paused, his voice becoming uncertain. "Herr Doctor, this can't be right. These components shouldn't survive being fired from a gun." Becker nodded slowly. "But they did. This shell was fired. The rifling marks on the casing prove it traveled through a barrel. Somehow, impossibly, this radio equipment survived the launch and remained functional." Over the next several hours, Becker and his team carefully documented every component. There was a miniature vacuum tube, smaller than anything in German production. A battery system with a clever activation mechanism. An antenna that deployed after firing. A trigger circuit connected to the main explosive charge. As they mapped out the system, the function became clear. This was a proximity fuse. The transmitter sent out radio waves. When the shell approached the ground, the reflected waves would trigger detonation at the optimal altitude for an airburst. No calculations needed, no timing required. The shell itself decided when to explode. The elegance of the design was stunning. But as an engineer, Becker immediately understood the implications, and they were terrifying. Becker sat at his desk, staring at the component analysis. Every part of the American fuse represented a significant engineering achievement. Taken together, they represented something beyond Germany's current capabilities. The vacuum tubes were the first problem. In 1945, German vacuum tubes were relatively large, fragile devices. They required careful handling and couldn't withstand significant shock. The Americans had somehow miniaturized them and ruggedized them to survive artillery launch. That alone suggested a level of manufacturing sophistication that was troubling. But it got worse. The battery system was brilliant. It used a glass vial filled with electrolyte. The force of firing the shell would shatter the vial, allowing the liquid to mix with the battery components and activate the power source. This meant the battery could be stored indefinitely without degradation, only becoming active when needed. German engineers had theorized about such a system, but implementing it required precision glasswork, carefully formulated electrolytes, and quality control standards that German factories, increasingly bombed and operating with forced labor, could no longer maintain. Becker called a meeting with his senior staff. Around the table sat some of Germany's most experienced weapons engineers. He laid out his findings. "Gentlemen, we are looking at a functional miniature radar set designed to survive being fired from an artillery piece. The Americans have solved problems we've been struggling with for years. The question before us is simple. Can we replicate this?" The discussion that followed was sobering. Every engineer present could see the brilliance of the design. Every engineer also understood that Germany couldn't build it. Dr. Wilhelm Schaefer, who specialized in electronics, shook his head. "The miniaturization alone is beyond us. Our vacuum tubes are too large, too fragile. To create tubes this small while maintaining functionality and durability would require manufacturing capabilities we don't have." Another engineer pointed to the materials analysis. "The casings are made of high-grade aluminum alloys. The circuitry uses copper that shows no signs of shortages or substitution. Every component is built to specifications we can no longer meet." Becker made notes. Then he asked the question that haunted him. "How many of these do you think the Americans have produced?" The room fell silent. Finally, Hauptmann Weber spoke. "Based on the reports from the Ardennes, thousands, possibly tens of thousands. They're using them as standard ammunition across entire artillery batteries." Becker did a quick calculation. Each fuse required dozens of precision components: vacuum tubes, resistors, capacitors, batteries, antenna assemblies. All manufactured to exacting standards, all assembled into a device small enough to fit in an artillery shell. And the Americans were producing them in massive quantities. "Gentlemen," Becker said quietly, "we need to understand what this means. The Americans haven't just developed a new weapon, they've developed a production system capable of mass-producing complex electronics under wartime conditions. While we're struggling to make basic ammunition, they're turning out miniature radar sets by the thousands." One of the older engineers, a man who'd worked in German industry since before World War I, spoke up. "Herr Doctor, with respect, I think you're underestimating the scale. If they can mass-produce something this complex, their industrial capacity exceeds anything we've imagined." Becker knew the engineer was right, and that realization led him to request something unusual: access to broader intelligence data on American production. 3 days later, Becker sat in a secure conference room with intelligence reports spread before him. What he read confirmed his worst fears and exceeded them. The American Fuse program, codenamed VT for variable time, had been massive. Intelligence suggested it was one of the largest wartime projects, rivaling even the atomic bomb program in funding. The development had taken place at Johns Hopkins University's Applied Physics Laboratory, involving hundreds of scientists and engineers. But it was the production numbers that made Becker feel physically sick. By late 1944, American factories were producing approximately 40,000 proximity fuses per day. Per day. That was more sophisticated electronics than Germany's entire electronics industry could produce in a month. And these weren't simple devices. Each one was a miniature marvel of engineering, more complex than most radios. The fuses were being manufactured at multiple facilities. Western Electric, a telephone company, had converted production lines to make them. So had other electronics manufacturers. The Americans had taken their peacetime industrial base, their experience with mass production of consumer electronics, and weaponized it. Becker pulled out German production figures for comparison. In 1944, Germany had produced approximately 40,000 aircraft total. The Americans were producing more proximity fuses than that every single day, and they were just artillery fuses, a small part of America's overall war production. The intelligence reports contained other troubling data. The Americans had first used these fuses in anti-aircraft roles in 1943. They'd achieved remarkable success rates against Japanese aircraft and German V-1 flying bombs. The fuses had been kept secret from ground combat, specifically to prevent Germany from capturing and reverse engineering them. The fact that they'd been deployed at the Battle of the Bulge meant one of two things. Either the Americans were so desperate they'd risk the secret, or they were so confident in their industrial advantage that compromise no longer mattered. Becker suspected it was the latter, and that suspicion was confirmed by another document, a British intelligence assessment of American industrial capacity. The United States was producing more war materiel than all other nations combined. Not just more than Germany. More than Germany, Britain, the Soviet Union, Japan, and Italy combined. The scale was incomprehensible. One statistic stood out. In 1944, American industry produced over 96,000 aircraft. Germany, with all its vaunted engineering expertise, produced about 40,000. The ratio was more than 2 to 1, but American aircraft were, on average, larger and more complex. A B-17 bomber required more aluminum and man-hours than 3 Bf-109 fighters. The material disparity was so vast, it rendered tactical and operational skill almost irrelevant. Germany could win every battle and still lose the war through simple attrition. Becker realized he was looking at the mathematical proof of Germany's defeat. The proximity fuse wasn't just a weapon. It was evidence of an industrial system operating at a level Germany couldn't approach, let alone match. Becker spent a week compiling his findings into a comprehensive report. He knew it would be unwelcome. The Nazi regime didn't respond well to pessimistic assessments, but as a scientist, he felt obligated to present the truth as clearly as possible. His report was divided into sections: the technical analysis of the fuse itself, complete with detailed diagrams and component breakdowns; an assessment of Germany's ability to replicate the technology, which he concluded was impossible with current resources; and finally, a strategic assessment of what the fuse's existence revealed about American industrial capacity. The final section was the most damning. Becker wrote, "The VT proximity fuse represents not merely a tactical advantage, but a fundamental strategic disparity. The ability to mass-produce complex electronic devices in wartime suggests an industrial base of unprecedented scale and sophistication. If American industry can manufacture 40,000 miniature radar sets daily, while simultaneously producing aircraft, tanks, ships, and conventional ammunition in overwhelming quantities, then Germany's material position is not merely unfavorable, but mathematically hopeless. No amount of tactical skill or soldier bravery can overcome a production ratio of this magnitude." He concluded with a stark recommendation: Germany should seek immediate armistice before additional casualties are incurred in a war that can no longer be won. Becker's commanding officer read the report with a grim expression. "Heinrich, you know this will be seen as defeatist, possibly treasonous." "Should I alter my findings?" Becker asked, knowing the answer. "No. The report is accurate. I'll forward it through channels. But prepare yourself. The leadership doesn't like uncomfortable truths." The report was sent to the Oberkommando der Wehrmacht, the German High Command. Becker never received an official response, but through informal channels, he heard it had been dismissed as excessively pessimistic and defeatist in nature. One general had reportedly said, "This engineer has been demoralized by enemy propaganda." The American fuse is a trick, a piece of luck, not evidence of systematic superiority. Becker wasn't surprised. He'd seen this pattern before. Intelligence that contradicted Nazi ideology was rejected regardless of evidence. The regime had built itself on the premise of German technological and racial superiority. Admitting that America had surpassed Germany in industrial and scientific capability would undermine the entire ideological foundation. But Becker knew the truth. He'd held the evidence in his hands. He'd done the calculations. Germany wasn't losing because of inferior soldiers or flawed tactics. Germany was losing because it was fighting an industrial war against an enemy with overwhelming material advantage. And no amount of willpower or ideological fervor could change mathematics. Becker's report may have been dismissed by high command, but it reached some field commanders. One of them, a colonel commanding an artillery regiment, requested a meeting with Becker. The colonel, a veteran of the Eastern and Western fronts, had a haunted look in his eyes. "Herr Doctor, I read your report on the American fuse. I need to know if your conclusions are accurate." Becker nodded. Every word. The colonel was quiet for a moment. "My men faced this weapon at the Bulge. We lost an entire battalion in minutes, not hours. Minutes. The survivors told me shells were exploding above them, that there was no shelter, nowhere to hide. At first I thought they were exaggerating, that the stress of combat had distorted their perceptions." "They weren't exaggerating," Becker said quietly. "No, they weren't." The colonel leaned forward. "Herr Doctor, I've been a soldier for 20 years. I've fought in Poland, France, Russia, North Africa, Italy. I've seen every kind of weapon. But this changes everything. How do you fight an enemy who can drop explosions on your head with perfect accuracy, regardless of weather or visibility? How do you train soldiers to survive a weapon that makes every defensive position useless?" Becker didn't have an answer. Because there wasn't one. The proximity fuse had fundamentally altered the calculus of ground combat. Traditional infantry tactics, developed over centuries, were suddenly obsolete. The colonel continued, "And if what your report says about American production is true, if they're making these by the tens of thousands per day, then every attack we launch, every defensive position we hold, will be hit by this weapon. We'll be ground down, piece by piece, with no way to counter it." "That's correct," Becker confirmed. The colonel stood, looking out the window at the ruins of Berlin, already battered by conventional bombing. "Then the war is over." "Not officially, not yet. But mathematically, strategically, it's done. We're just waiting for the end." After the colonel left, Becker sat alone in his office. He thought about all the brilliant German engineers and scientists who'd developed remarkable weapons. The V-2 rocket, the Me-262 jet fighter, advanced tanks and submarines. Technical marvels, all of them. But they were marvels produced in small numbers, often too late, always in insufficient quantities. Germany had focused on quality and sophistication, while America had mastered quantity and reliability. And in an industrial war, quantity was its own quality. The proximity fuse was just one example, but it was representative of a larger truth. America wasn't just producing more weapons. It was producing better logistics, better training systems, better everything. And doing it all at a scale Germany couldn't comprehend, let alone match. After the war, when production figures were declassified, Becker's estimates proved conservative. He'd actually underestimated American capability. The final production total for VT proximity fuses exceeded 22 million units. 22 million miniature radar sets, each one a sophisticated electronic device, all produced in less than 2 years of full-scale manufacturing. To put that in perspective, Germany's entire production of all types of fuses for all types of munitions during the war was roughly 500 million units. But those were simple mechanical or timed fuses, not complex electronic devices. The Americans had produced 22 million smart fuses, while also producing hundreds of millions of conventional fuses for other munitions. The cost of the VT fuse program was over $1 billion in 1940s dollars, comparable to the Manhattan Project. But unlike the atomic bomb, which was used only twice, the proximity fuse was deployed in massive quantities and had a direct, measurable impact on battlefield outcomes. General George Patton, after witnessing the fuse's effects during the Battle of the Bulge, wrote that it won the battle for us. He later stated that he believed it was one of the 3 most important developments of the war, alongside the atomic bomb and radar. The British, who received large quantities of VT fuses through Lend-Lease, conducted their own analysis. Their conclusion: The Proximity Fuze increased the effectiveness of anti-aircraft artillery by a factor of 5 and ground artillery by a factor of 3. In other words, every shell with a VT fuse was worth 3 to 5 conventional shells. This force multiplication effect, combined with America's already overwhelming production advantage, created a situation where German forces were simply buried under an avalanche of firepower they couldn't counter or match. Becker survived the war and was interrogated by American technical intelligence officers. They were particularly interested in his 1945 report on the VT fuse. "Did you really conclude from examining these fuses that Germany had lost the war?" an American officer asked. Becker nodded. "Not from the fuses alone, but from what they represented. The ability to mass-produce complex electronics during wartime suggested an industrial capacity we couldn't match. Every component, every specification, required resources and manufacturing capability that Germany lacked." "But you were just examining captured ammunition. Surely you couldn't extrapolate the entire strategic situation from that." "I could and did," Becker replied. "When you see a single component of your enemy's supply chain, and that component is more sophisticated than your most advanced weapons, and it's being produced in quantities that exceed your total production of similar items, the strategic conclusion is inescapable." The American officer made notes. "We found your report in German archives. It was marked defeatist assessment, no action required. Did that surprise you?" Becker smiled bitterly. "No. In the Third Reich, accurate assessment of material disadvantage was considered treason. The ideology required belief in German superiority, regardless of evidence. When reality contradicted that belief, reality was dismissed." "So you knew your report would be ignored?" "I knew, but I had to write it anyway. As a scientist, as an engineer, I couldn't remain silent about what I'd discovered, even if no one wanted to hear it." The story of Heinrich Becker and the VT fuse is a microcosm of Germany's larger strategic failure. Time and again, competent professionals presented accurate assessments of Germany's deteriorating position and were ignored or punished. Admiral Canaris warned about American industrial capacity and was dismissed. Albert Speer knew Germany couldn't win a production war, but remained silent. Adolf Galland recognized American aircraft superiority and was called a defeatist. Sepp Dietrich knew the Ardennes offensive would fail for lack of fuel and was ignored. Now Becker joined that list. An engineer who examined captured technology, reached an accurate conclusion about strategic reality, and was dismissed because that reality contradicted Nazi ideology. The pattern was consistent and fatal. The Nazi regime had built itself on myths of racial and technological superiority. When confronted with evidence that those myths were false, the evidence was rejected. It was more important to maintain ideological purity than to acknowledge strategic reality. This willful blindness extended to the Proximity Fuze's tactical implications. Even after German forces had been decimated by the weapon at the bulge, even after thousands of soldiers had been killed by airbursts they couldn't defend against, the High Command refused to acknowledge that this represented a fundamental shift in warfare. Some generals insisted it was just a lucky weapon that German soldiers would adapt. Others claimed the reports were exaggerated, that battle stress was causing troops to overstate the fuse's effectiveness. The idea that America had developed and deployed a genuinely revolutionary weapon in massive quantities was too threatening to accept. But the soldiers knew. Every German infantryman who survived an artillery barrage in 1945 learned to fear the American shells that exploded in mid-air. Foxholes, the basic defensive position that had protected soldiers since World War I, were now death traps. There was no defense, no tactic, no training that could counter the Proximity Fuze. Becker's report had predicted this. He'd written that the fuse eliminates the primary means by which infantry survive artillery bombardment, creating a battlefield environment where defensive positions offer no protection. He'd been exactly right. What haunted Becker in the years after the war was how obvious the conclusion should have been. The numbers were available. The evidence was clear. Germany was fighting an industrial war against an enemy with overwhelming material superiority, and no amount of tactical skill could overcome that disparity. The Proximity Fuze was just one example among many. American production statistics were available through intelligence channels. The United States produced over 300,000 aircraft during the war. Germany produced about 94,000. American ship production exceeded that of all other nations combined. American munitions production was so vast that allies like Britain and the Soviet Union were supplied with American equipment, even while US forces fought on multiple fronts. The arithmetic was brutal and inescapable. Germany was outnumbered, outproduced, and increasingly outperformed technologically. The sophisticated weapons Germany did produce, like the Me-262 jet or the Type 21 submarine, came too late and in too few numbers to matter. Meanwhile, America was producing millions of trucks, billions of rounds of ammunition, and yes, 22 million proximity fuses. The scale of production was so vast that waste became acceptable. American forces could afford to expend ammunition at rates that would bankrupt the German war economy. Becker had seen this disparity crystallized in those 3 captured shells on his examination table. Each one represented a triumph of miniaturization, precision manufacturing, and mass production. Each one proved that America had achieved an industrial sophistication Germany couldn't match. And there were millions more where those came from. The VT Proximity Fuze stands as one of World War II's most significant yet least known technological achievements. It saved thousands of Allied lives, first by defending ships from air attack, then by devastating German ground forces at critical moments. But from the German perspective, it was something else. A revelation of just how outmatched they were. Not outmatched by a small margin that skill could overcome, but fundamentally, mathematically outmatched by an industrial system operating at a scale they couldn't approach. Heinrich Becker was one of many German professionals who saw this truth and tried to communicate it. Like the others, he was ignored. The Nazi regime's commitment to racial and technological superiority mythology made it impossible to accept reality when reality contradicted ideology. The cost of that blindness was catastrophic. The war continued for 4 more months after Becker submitted his report. Hundreds of thousands more died, millions more were displaced, and German cities were reduced to rubble. All in service of a cause that multiple competent professionals had already concluded was mathematically impossible. The lesson extends beyond World War II. When ideology becomes more important than evidence, when loyalty is valued over accuracy, when uncomfortable truths are suppressed rather than addressed, catastrophic failure becomes inevitable. Becker's examination of those 3 artillery shells should have triggered a fundamental reassessment of Germany's strategic position. Instead, it was filed away and forgotten. The smart weapons kept falling from the sky. The arithmetic of defeat continued its inexorable calculation. And the Third Reich marched toward its inevitable end, blind to a reality it refused to see. The Proximity Fuze changed warfare forever, but its examination by German engineers revealed something even more important: the fatal consequences of valuing ideology over truth, of choosing comforting myths over uncomfortable mathematics. In the end, reality doesn't care what you believe. The smart shells proved that beyond any doubt. May 1943. Over the skies of northern France, General der Jagdflieger Adolf Galland pushed his Messerschmitt Bf 109 into a climbing turn, tracking what should have been an easy target. An American fighter, grotesquely fat and ungainly, lumbering through the air like a pregnant cow. His pilots had been calling it the fliegende Milchflasche, the flying milk bottle. A joke, an insult to the elegant, deadly machines of the Luftwaffe. Galland lined up his shot, preparing to add another kill to his impressive tally of over 100 aerial victories. Then, the impossible happened. The American fighter, this supposed clumsy behemoth, suddenly rolled inverted and dove. Not a panicked dive, but a controlled, high-speed maneuver that took it from 25,000 feet to near ground level in seconds. Galland tried to follow, pushing his 109 into a dive, but within moments, his controls began to stiffen. His aircraft, which handled beautifully in a turning dogfight, became sluggish and unresponsive at high speed. By the time he pulled out of the dive, the American was gone, simply vanished. Galland returned to his base, shaken. He'd been flying combat missions since the Spanish Civil War. He'd faced the best the RAF had to offer during the Battle of Britain, and in all those years, he'd never encountered anything like this. That evening, Galland sat down and wrote a detailed report. The American P-47 Thunderbolt was not the joke his pilots believed it to be. It was fast, possibly faster than the 109 in level flight at high altitude. It was heavily armed with 8.50 caliber machine guns that could shred a German fighter in seconds. And most disturbingly, it seemed to be nearly indestructible. Reports were coming in from other units of P-47s returning to base after absorbing damage that would have destroyed any German aircraft. Galland's conclusion was stark and unambiguous. The P-47 represented a serious threat. Luftwaffe tactics would need to change immediately. German pilots could no longer rely on the superiority they'd enjoyed for the first years of the war. If they tried to fight the P-47 using conventional dogfighting techniques, they would die. He sent the report up the chain of command to Reichsmarschall Hermann Göring, commander of the Luftwaffe and the second most powerful man in Nazi Germany. Galland expected immediate action, orders to disseminate new tactical guidelines, perhaps authorization to accelerate development of new German fighters to counter the threat. What he got instead was silence. Then, a week later, a summons to Göring's headquarters. What followed was one of the most surreal and infuriating conversations of Galland's career, and it marked the beginning of his transformation from loyal officer to internal dissident, a man who would spend the rest of the war trying desperately to save the Luftwaffe from the incompetence and delusion of its own leadership. Hermann Göring was, by 1943, a caricature of his former self. Once a decorated World War I flying ace and a charismatic leader, he had devolved into a vain, corrupt, drug-addicted megalomaniac. His opulent lifestyle, his obsession with looting art from occupied territories, and his refusal to accept any information that contradicted his worldview had made him a liability. But he was Hitler's oldest and most loyal lieutenant, and his position was unassailable. When Galland arrived at Göring's estate, he was kept waiting for hours. When the Reichsmarschall finally appeared, he was in a foul mood. The strategic bombing campaign by the Americans and British was intensifying. German cities were being pounded night and day, and Göring, who had famously promised that no enemy bombs would ever fall on German soil, was feeling the pressure. Galland began his briefing. He described his encounter with the P-47. He presented intelligence reports from frontline units. He laid out the technical specifications as best they could be determined: speed, armament, rate of climb, combat radius. Everything pointed to the same conclusion. The P-47 was a formidable opponent, and the Luftwaffe needed to adapt immediately. Göring listened, his face growing redder with each word. When Galland finished, there was a long, tense silence. Then Göring exploded. "This is defeatist propaganda," he screamed. "The Americans cannot build airplanes. They are very good at refrigerators and razor blades, but fighters? Impossible." Galland tried to interject, to present more evidence, but Göring cut him off. The entire report, he declared, was American psychological warfare designed to demoralize German pilots. The P-47 was a crude, heavy machine built by a nation of shopkeepers and mongrels. It might look intimidating, but in the hands of Germany's superior pilots, it would be swept from the sky. Galland, choosing his words carefully, pointed out that he himself had engaged the P-47, that he had seen its capabilities firsthand, that it was not propaganda, but observable reality. This was a mistake. Göring's face went from red to purple. "Are you questioning my judgment, Herr General? Are you suggesting that I, who commanded fighters in the Great War, do not understand air combat?" Galland knew he was on dangerous ground. In Hitler's Germany, contradicting a superior, especially one as powerful and vindictive as Göring, could be fatal. But he pressed on. Herr Reichsmarschall, I am simply reporting what I have observed. The P-47 is a serious threat. If we do not adapt our tactics, we will suffer unnecessary losses. Göring waved his hand dismissively. You worry too much, Galland. The Luftwaffe is invincible. We have the best aircraft, the best pilots, the best tactics. These American bombers and their escorts are temporary inconveniences. Once our new jets are operational, we will sweep them from the sky. Now, I have more important matters to attend to. Dismissed. Galland left the meeting in a state of disbelief and rage. He had presented facts, hard data from combat operations, and been dismissed as if he were a hysterical child. But Göring's attitude wasn't unique. It was pervasive throughout the Nazi leadership. The ideology of German racial and technological superiority had created a cognitive wall that facts simply could not penetrate. The Americans were inferior. Therefore, anything they built had to be inferior. It was a circular logic, immune to evidence. And Galland knew, with a sinking certainty, that this delusion was going to cost thousands of German lives. In the months following that disastrous meeting, Galland watched his worst fears come true. The P-47 Thunderbolts, flying escort for American bomber formations, began to appear in ever-increasing numbers, and they were slaughtering Luftwaffe fighters. The tactics that had worked so well against the RAF Spitfires and Hurricanes were proving suicidal against the Thunderbolt. German pilots, trained in the art of the turning dogfight, would engage the P-47s at medium altitude. The Americans, following their doctrine of boom and zoom, would refuse the engagement. Instead, they would climb to 30,000 feet or higher, where the P-47's turbo-supercharged engine gave it overwhelming superiority. From that altitude, the Thunderbolts would dive on the German formations with terrifying speed. The attack would last only seconds. A high-speed pass, 8.50 caliber machine guns blazing, and then the P-47 would zoom climb back to altitude before the German pilots could react. If a German fighter tried to follow the Thunderbolt into the dive, he would find his controls stiffening, his aircraft becoming unresponsive at high speed. By the time he pulled out, the American was already back at altitude, ready for another pass. It was a form of combat the Luftwaffe had no answer for. The German fighters, optimized for agility and turning performance, were being systematically destroyed by an opponent who refused to fight on German terms. The loss rates were catastrophic. In the summer and fall of 1943, the Luftwaffe was losing pilots and aircraft faster than they could be replaced. Every week, Galland received reports of experienced pilots shot down. Men who had survived years of combat, who had dozens or even hundreds of kills, were being killed by American fighters flown by pilots with a fraction of their experience. The difference was the aircraft and the tactics. A mediocre pilot in a P-47, following the boom and zoom doctrine, could kill an ace in a Bf-109 or FW-190 if the German pilot made the mistake of engaging on the Americans' terms. Galland tried repeatedly to get the high command to acknowledge the problem. He wrote report after report. He presented statistics. He brought frontline pilots to briefings to describe their experiences. The response was always the same: excuses, denial, and accusations of defeatism. Göring insisted the problem was not the enemy aircraft, but the quality of German pilots. They were becoming cowards, he claimed, unwilling to press home their attacks. He began to question the courage and fighting spirit of the Luftwaffe's fighter pilots, the same men who were dying in droves trying to defend German cities from the relentless Allied bombing campaign. The breaking point came during a staff meeting in late 1943. Göring, frustrated by the Luftwaffe's inability to stop the American daylight bombing raids, launched into a tirade. He accused the fighter pilots of cowardice and incompetence. He claimed they were abandoning the bombers, refusing to engage the enemy. Galland, who had attended the meeting along with other senior Luftwaffe officers, finally snapped. He stood up and, in front of the entire room, called Göring a liar. He described in brutal detail the conditions the fighter pilots were facing. Outnumbered, outgunned, flying obsolete aircraft against an enemy with overwhelming material superiority. The pilots weren't cowards. They were heroes fighting an impossible battle while their own leadership buried its head in the sand. The room went silent. No one spoke to Göring like that. Several officers expected Galland to be arrested on the spot. But Göring, perhaps recognizing that removing his most capable fighter commander would be a public relations disaster, simply glared at Galland and ended the meeting. From that moment on, Galland was a marked man. Göring and his cronies began looking for any excuse to remove him from command. But Galland didn't care anymore. He had seen the future, and it was written in the contrails of thousands of American bombers and fighters darkening the skies over Germany. The Luftwaffe was doomed, not because it lacked brave men, but because it was led by fools and fanatics. In February 1944, Galland's worst predictions came to pass in the most devastating fashion imaginable. The Allies launched Operation Argument, which would come to be known as Big Week. It was a coordinated, massive assault on the German aircraft industry designed to achieve absolute air superiority before the planned invasion of France. For 6 days, waves of American B-17 and B-24 bombers, escorted by swarms of P-47 Thunderbolts, P-38 Lightnings, and the new P-51 Mustangs, pounded aircraft factories across Germany and occupied Europe. The Luftwaffe rose to defend, throwing every available fighter into the battle. It was exactly what the Americans wanted. The combat was apocalyptic. On the first day alone, the Luftwaffe launched over 200 sorties against the American formations. The German pilots were brave, pressing their attacks with suicidal determination. But they were facing an enemy they simply couldn't match. The P-47s, flying high cover, dove on the German formations with brutal efficiency. The Thunderbolt's 8.50 caliber machine guns created a wall of lead that shredded the lightly built German fighters. A single burst could tear the wing off a Bf-109, a 2-second burst could set an FW-190 ablaze, and the P-47s themselves seemed nearly indestructible. German pilots reported pouring cannon fire into the big American fighters, seeing hits register, and watching in disbelief as the P-47s simply absorbed the damage and kept fighting. Galland personally flew multiple missions during Big Week, leading from the front as he always had. On the third day, he engaged a formation of P-47s escorting bombers over Brunswick. His wingman was shot down in the first pass. Galland himself narrowly avoided being killed when a Thunderbolt appeared out of nowhere, its guns tearing through his left wing. He managed to break off and escape, but it was a close call. That night, examining his damaged aircraft, Galland counted over 30.50 caliber bullet holes. If even one of those rounds had hit the fuel tank or the coolant system of his liquid-cooled engine, he would have been dead. The realization was sobering. He was one of the best fighter pilots in the world, flying with over 15 years of combat experience, and he had nearly been killed by an American pilot he never even saw coming. By the end of Big Week, the statistics were catastrophic for Germany. The Luftwaffe had lost over 350 fighters and nearly 100 bombers. More importantly, they had lost over 250 pilots, many of them experienced veterans who could not be replaced. The German aircraft industry had been dealt a crippling blow. Factories that produced fighter aircraft, engines, and components had been destroyed or heavily damaged. It would take months to recover, months Germany didn't have. The Americans, by contrast, had lost about 250 bombers and fewer than 30 fighters. And every single one of those losses would be replaced within weeks. The production pipeline from American factories was limitless. Galland wrote yet another report, this one even more urgent than his previous warnings. The Luftwaffe, he stated bluntly, had lost the battle for air superiority over Germany. The industrial and material advantage of the Allies, particularly the Americans, was so overwhelming that no amount of tactical brilliance or pilot bravery could overcome it. The P-47, which had been dismissed as a joke just a year earlier, was now the dominant fighter over Europe. And there was nothing Germany could do about it. Göring's response was predictable. He accused Galland of defeatism and ordered the report buried. But by this point, even Göring couldn't completely ignore reality. The skies over Germany were darkening with Allied aircraft. German cities were being reduced to rubble. The Luftwaffe was being ground down in a war of attrition it could never win. By late 1944, the situation had deteriorated beyond recognition. The Allies had successfully invaded France. German forces were retreating on all fronts, and the Luftwaffe, once the pride of the Third Reich, was a shadow of its former self. Pilot losses had been so severe that new pilots were being sent to frontline units with minimal training. In 1940, a Luftwaffe fighter pilot might have had 200 or 300 hours of flight training before seeing combat. By 1944, many had fewer than 50 hours. They were being thrown into combat against experienced Allied pilots flying superior aircraft. It was, as Galland described it, sending lambs to the slaughter. The P-47 Thunderbolt was now ubiquitous in the skies over Germany, and it had been joined by even more advanced American fighters like the P-51 Mustang, which combined the Thunderbolt's firepower with even greater range and speed. German pilots who survived their first few missions learned quickly: never, ever try to turn with the American fighters at low altitude. Never try to outclimb them. Never let them dictate the terms of engagement. But for inexperienced pilots, these lessons came too late. The attrition rate for new Luftwaffe pilots was horrific. Some units were losing 50% of their new pilots in the first week of combat. Galland, who had been promoted to general of the fighter arm, responsible for all Luftwaffe fighter operations, was in an impossible position. He had the authority on paper, but no real power. Göring interfered constantly, issuing contradictory orders and refusing to allocate resources where they were needed. Hitler, increasingly detached from reality, demanded miracle weapons and final victories. Galland was expected to defend German airspace with an ever-shrinking force of poorly trained pilots flying aircraft that were outclassed by the enemy. In November 1944, Galland did something unprecedented. He organized what came to be known as the Fighter Pilots' Revolt. Along with several other senior fighter commanders, he drafted a letter directly to Göring demanding changes. The letter was blunt to the point of insubordination. It stated that the current leadership of the Luftwaffe was incompetent, that Göring's refusal to accept reality was costing German lives, that the constant interference from the high command was making it impossible to conduct effective operations, and it demanded that either Göring step down or give the fighter commanders the autonomy to run operations without political interference. The letter was signed by some of the most decorated and respected fighter pilots in the Luftwaffe, men with hundreds of kills between them, men who had risked their lives for Germany countless times. Göring's response was immediate and vicious. He called the signatories traitors. He threatened them with court-martial and execution, and he removed Galland from command, effectively ending his operational career. Galland was devastated, but not surprised. He had known the risks, but he and his fellow pilots had reached a point where they could no longer remain silent. Too many good men were dying because of incompetent leadership. Too many lies were being told to the German people about the state of the war. Someone had to speak the truth, even if it meant career suicide. Galland was placed under house arrest, forbidden from flying combat missions. For a man who had lived and breathed aerial combat for his entire adult life, it was a kind of death. He sat in his quarters, listening to the reports of Allied bombers pounding German cities, knowing that the Luftwaffe was being systematically destroyed, unable to do anything about it. In the final months of the war, Germany was collapsing. The Soviets were closing in from the east, the Americans and British from the west. German cities were in ruins. The economy was shattered, and the Luftwaffe, what remained of it, was flying on fumes, literally. Fuel was so scarce that training flights had been almost entirely suspended. New pilots were being sent to combat with virtually no preparation. In a last desperate gamble, Galland was allowed to form an elite unit, Jagdverband 44, equipped with the revolutionary Me-262 jet fighter. The Me-262 was, in many ways, the aircraft Germany should have had 2 years earlier. It was fast, over 100 miles per hour faster than any Allied fighter. It was heavily armed. In the hands of an experienced pilot, it was deadly. But it was too little, too late. Germany was out of fuel, out of time, and out of pilots. Galland's unit flew a handful of missions, achieving some success, but it was meaningless in the grand strategic picture. The war was over. Germany had lost. And the Luftwaffe, once the most powerful air force in the world, had been annihilated. On May 8, 1945, Germany surrendered unconditionally. Galland, along with thousands of other Luftwaffe personnel, was taken into Allied custody. During his interrogation, American and British intelligence officers questioned him extensively about the war, about German tactics, and about the leadership of the Luftwaffe. Galland was brutally honest. He described Göring's incompetence, Hitler's interference, and the systemic denial that had plagued German leadership. When asked specifically about the P-47 Thunderbolt, Galland's assessment was unequivocal. It was one of the best fighters of the war. We underestimated it completely. Our leadership dismissed it as crude American engineering, but it was anything but. It was fast, tough, heavily armed, and produced in numbers we could never match. The pilots who flew it were well-trained and disciplined. They exploited its strengths and avoided its weaknesses. By 1944, encountering a formation of P-47s was a death sentence for inexperienced German pilots. The American officers pressed him. Why didn't German leadership recognize the threat earlier? Galland's laugh was bitter. Because they refused to accept reality. They believed in German superiority with religious fervor. Any evidence that contradicted that belief was dismissed as propaganda or defeatism. I tried to warn them. I tried multiple times. But in the Third Reich, telling the truth was considered treason. When the final accounting was done, the statistics painted a picture of total German defeat in the air war. The United States had produced over 15,600 P-47 Thunderbolts during the war. At peak production, one Thunderbolt was rolling off the assembly line every single hour. Germany, with all its vaunted engineering expertise, produced about 36,000 single-engine fighters total during the entire war, across all types. And German production was constantly disrupted by Allied bombing. The Americans, safe behind two oceans, could produce aircraft unmolested. The kill ratios told the same story. In 1943, when the P-47 first entered large-scale combat, German fighters still achieved rough parity. But by 1944, the P-47 was achieving kill ratios of 4-to-1 or higher. American pilots were better trained, flying better aircraft, supported by better logistics. The attrition rate for Luftwaffe pilots became unsustainable. In 1944 alone, Germany lost over 13,000 aircrew, killed, wounded, or missing. That's more than the entire pre-war strength of the Luftwaffe's fighter force, and they couldn't be replaced. The training pipeline had collapsed. Fuel shortages meant new pilots got minimal flight hours. The experienced aces, men like Galland with hundreds of kills, couldn't be everywhere at once. They were being slowly worn down in a war of attrition that Germany couldn't win. The P-47 was the steel-tipped spear of that campaign. Along with the P-51 Mustang, it systematically destroyed the Luftwaffe. Not in a single decisive battle, but through relentless, grinding attrition. German cities were pounded into rubble by bombers escorted by Thunderbolts. German fighters were shot down by the hundreds, then by the thousands. The industrial capacity of Germany, already stretched thin by the two-front war, was systematically dismantled. The P-47 also excelled in ground attack, a role it took on increasingly as the Luftwaffe ceased to be a meaningful threat. In the final year of the war, P-47s ranged across Germany and occupied Europe, destroying trains, tanks, trucks, supply depots. Anything that moved. The psychological impact on German troops was severe. The sound of the P-47's distinctive R2800 engine became associated with death from above. German soldiers learned to fear clear weather because it meant the Jabos, the fighter bombers, would be hunting. Adolf Galland survived the war and lived until 1996. In his later years, he became friends with many of his former enemies, including several American P-47 pilots. He attended air shows, gave lectures, and wrote extensively about his experiences. When asked about the biggest mistakes Germany made in the air war, his answer was always the same. Arrogance. We believed we were superior, and that belief blinded us to reality. The Americans weren't supposed to be able to build fighters like the P-47. They were a nation of shopkeepers and mechanics. But they took their industrial genius, their engineering knowledge, and they built an aircraft that was perfect for the kind of war they needed to fight. And they built it in numbers we couldn't imagine. Gallen's story is a mirror to that of men like Admiral Canaris and Albert Speer. Men who saw the truth, who understood the mathematical reality of Germany's strategic situation, but who were trapped in a system where truth was subordinate to ideology. Canaris tried to warn about American industrial capacity and was dismissed. Speer knew Germany couldn't win a production war and remained silent. Gallen recognized the P-47 as a deadly threat and was called a defeatist. In all three cases, the Nazi leadership's refusal to accept reality sealed Germany's fate. The Third Reich was built on a foundation of lies, racial superiority, ideological purity, the inevitability of German victory. These weren't just propaganda. They were articles of faith believed with religious fervor by Hitler and his inner circle. When reality contradicted those beliefs, reality was dismissed. Intelligence reports were ignored. Officers who spoke uncomfortable truths were punished. The entire system was designed to reinforce Hitler's delusions, even as the Reich burned. Gallen's particular tragedy is that he was a patriot. He loved Germany. He believed in defending his homeland. But he was clear-eyed enough to see that Germany's leadership was driving the nation toward destruction, and he was powerless to stop it. His warnings about the P-47 were just one example. He also warned about the futility of Hitler's offensive in the Ardennes, the Battle of the Bulge. He warned that converting the Me-262 jet into a bomber instead of a fighter was strategic insanity. Every time, he was ignored or punished. The story of Adolf Galland and the P-47 Thunderbolt is a study in the collision between competence and ideology. Galland was, by any measure, one of the finest fighter pilots and commanders of World War II. He understood aerial tactics, aircraft performance, and strategic reality. But he served a regime that valued loyalty over competence, ideology over truth. And that regime was defeated not by a lack of courage or fighting spirit, but by its own willful blindness. The P-47 Thunderbolt was the physical manifestation of everything the Nazi leadership couldn't accept. It was built by a diverse, democratic society. Its production line employed women, African Americans, immigrants, the kind of people Nazi ideology dismissed as inferior. And yet, this mongrel society built over 15,000 of these fighters. They built them well, they built them tough, and they built them fast. The German response should have been immediate adaptation, new tactics, new aircraft designs, new training protocols. Instead, the response was denial and accusations of cowardice. The Luftwaffe was expected to fight the American industrial juggernaut with inadequate resources and obsolete tactics, all while being told that victory was inevitable if only they had sufficient will. It was a recipe for disaster, and disaster is exactly what they got. Galland tried to change the system from within. He tried to inject reality into the decision-making process, and he was crushed for his efforts. His story is a reminder that in authoritarian systems, telling the truth is an act of rebellion, and rebellion, no matter how necessary, is punished. If you found this deep dive into one of World War II's most important but overlooked stories compelling, make sure you're subscribed to the channel and hit the notification bell. History is full of moments where courage meant speaking truth to power, even when that truth was unwelcome. Adolf Galland's warnings about the P-47 Thunderbolt were vindicated by history, but by the time reality could no longer be denied, it was too late. The lesson is timeless. Ignore your enemy's capabilities at your peril. Dismiss uncomfortable truths at your own risk. And never ever confuse propaganda with reality. The P-47 wasn't supposed to be a great fighter, It was too heavy, too crude, too American. But it helped destroy the Luftwaffe and won the air war over Europe. Because in the end, physics and mathematics don't care about ideology. And the Thunderbolt was the reality that shattered the Nazi fantasy of invincibility.